Welcome to part 3 of our Swivel housing overhaul. So what we're going to do, we've got it on the bench, we're going to strip down the components. You can do this operation with the axle still on the vehicle or even the axle on axle stands in your workshop. First thing we need to do is remove the hub, complete with the brake disc. Get down to the stub axle and strip that off as well. If you have ABS fitted, then you need to lift the sensor out of the way so it doesn't damage anything as you pull out the CV joint. So the first thing we need to do is to take the cap off with a screwdriver. Underneath you're going to find that the CV shaft that comes through the driving flange is held on by a clip here. Sometimes this circlip will be frozen in there, so it's worth giving it a tap around just to free it off before you get some circlip pliers and remove it. I'd advise as well to screw a bolt into the end here so you can pull the drive shaft out as such. There should be spacers packed in here to stop the CV joint end float. The spacers you can see here, and this is more realistic because this hasn't been stripped down. You can see the amount of grot. And you never know whether this is actually going to be seized in or not, but this one isn't, luckily. What you'll find with these Land Rover axles, as the CV joint shoulder wears on this bronze bush on the stub axle, it will actually give you more end float, so this needs to be checked from time to time. So if you are keeping most of these components and you just want to make sure the end float of the CV shaft is right, then you need to get yourself some feeler gauges and measure it. Checking it when you're stripping it down is optional, but when you put this back together you will need to check and make sure you get the correct end float for this. This is actually quite important. I'm not going to tell you how to use circlip pliers, I'm pretty sure that you know how to use these. However, if you're going to invest in a set, get one that are adjustable. You can change the tips on them and you can reverse them. And these ones are actually quite expensive. Here's a little tip when you're doing your drive flange bolts, is that you can use a bar wedged in this manner so that it will assist you to be able to pull and put torque on the bolts. A little trick here is to actually have it as close or parallel to the bar as you can while you're doing it. If on the other hand you do it at something like 90 degrees like this, it is going to be a lot more effort. So what you'd be better off doing is pulling it up like this. Refrain from using air guns and use hand tools. This way you're not going to snap any bolts in the hub, or at very least minimise the amount of hassle that you have to give yourself later on. You could either use a chisel to lift off the drive shaft or do this, which is using a hammer, and I'm hitting it where the bolts are, and this stops the holes from being squashed up and stopping you from getting the bolts back in. This works quite often, as you can see here. I've got it loose. Okay, so the drive flange can come off now. It should be drawn off quite easily. If not, then you might have to use WD-40 to get the rust out of the splines. You have the hub nuts here with a locking tab. This is the top nut, and the locking tab itself stops the top nut from undoing. What we usually do is use a wide chisel like this, get it in there, slap it with a hammer and bend it down. Like so. Ideally what you need is a chisel that is wide enough like this to be able to do it in one go. Standard hub nut size is 52mm, and I'm using a very heavy duty one which you can get from Paddock. It's on their automotive tools section on their website, and it's a matter of just undoing the top nut or cracking the tension off it first. The second type of axle has a 52mm staked nut, and the 52mm socket that I have here is ideal for undoing this nut. The thing is, with this one it's at a higher torque. Okay, so the socket itself, I've got an adapter with a 3/4 inch, and the socket is heavy duty enough to cope with it. I would not use air guns on this, but use something rather meaty, and I'm using a bar to be able to pull this round because this is fucking tight. Play safely when you do this. and you're better to lift it up than push it down so you don't smack your knuckles on the ground. Okay, so once the torque has been cracked off, then it's just a matter of unwinding it. Perhaps it's just a habit of mine, but I like to unwind the nuts with my fingers to find out if the threads are okay on the stub axle. Again, with this one you might have to give the hub a tap just to dislodge the washer so you can pull the whole lot out. As you can see, I've got my fingers over the washer, so I've got the bearing and everything all in one go. There you go, that's off. With the older type of stub axle with a double lock nut, you might have to use something like a screwdriver or 2 screwdrivers to lift your washer plate out. Alright, I would change these every time you do them. Once that's out, you can then get the adjuster nut and wind that off. Again, I'm using my fingers to see if there's any damage on the threads. Okay, so I'll wind this off. Obviously you'll be using gloves because it'll be a lot dirtier. Put your thumbs or your fingers and hold the bearing in place. Now obviously this is demo model and I haven't got a seal, but it all should come off in one go. If the bearing's stuck on there, it probably is stuck. Right then, so far so good. Next job is to take the stub axle off with these bolts. Right, well, I don't need to show you winding these all off, but they are tight. Again, they're stuck in with thread locks, so you might have a bit of a fight to undo them. First off, just a tip here, and this is just a work habit, is to protect the threads of the stub axle, especially the first few, because they're the ones that are going to cause you most hassle if you can't get the knot on. And then give the stub axle a tap so it breaks the seal of the gasket. Alright, you can see that's already broken. Don't need to struggle with that. Make sure your nuts and your bolts, your plates and everything else are kept all in the same place. Alright, that one just fell off, that's quite good. What you'll see underneath now is you have access to your CV joint. So if you're just changing your CV joint, that's easy enough. Well, remember I told you to lift the ABS sensor out of the way. Well, this is not to cause any damage because the teeth that are on the CV joint, if you've got ABS, will be the sensor exciter ring for the ABS. So you don't want to get that damaged. So it's a matter of pulling this half shaft right the way out, and there you have it.